everybody. This is Michael Munson, and I'm really happy that you're all here with us today. We wanted to just give people a few minutes to roll in before we got started. We are going to get started now for the sake of our time today. Thank you for being here. I'm really happy that all of you are joining us from across the country today. Again, I'm Michael Munson, and I'm here today with Lori Cook-Daniels, who's the back end for today, and we'll be able to hopefully answer any questions that you might have about tech or about slides or about recording or about anything else. So again, I wanted to get us rolling so that we can fill the time with all the content that we have for you today. I'd like us to just take a moment as we begin our time together, and whatever your beliefs are, if you could just take a moment to acknowledge the land that you're on. I know that we're on different lands, but in some respects on one land across the country today. So however you choose to honor that land, I believe at least that the land will appreciate that acknowledgement, and we kind of all need to give a little bit back to the land that works so hard for us and has so many memories and ancestral roots. Thank you. Our agenda for the day is pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about what ACEs are, the original ACE study. We'll look at the fact that there's a lifelong history of health disparities within trans communities. We'll look at trans-specific ACEs. The ACEs could be in quotes for that since they aren't official, but are what we've developed over the years. We'll look at the impact of current events a little bit throughout our discussion today. And then we'll look at what you can do and some resources. I want to remind everybody to take care of yourself today. Today is probably going to be one of the more intensive webinars that we present because it will have a lot of data, and a lot of data that does focus on negative health impacts. So please feel free to take care of yourself and know that this will be recorded. This is being recorded and will be available to you later on if you'd like to watch it later. A quick little bit about who I am and who Forge is. I am Michael Munson. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I am Forge's executive director and our primary trainer. For visual access, I am a white appearing round-ish person with a light lavender shirt on today with a black t-shirt underneath. I wear glasses and have a very uncontrolled beard right now and fluffy hair. And behind me is a black background, so that gives you a little bit of a frame for visual access. A little bit about Forge for those who don't know who Forge is or what Forge is. We are a national trans organization that is 100% funded to focus on anti-violence issues related to transgender and non-binary survivors. We were founded in 1994, so this marks our 28th year in operation. We are mostly headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but have staff on the coasts, which is really fantastic. We predominantly do training and technical assistance. So webinars like this, conferences, publications intended for victim service providers and other allied professionals. So therapists, campus educators, folks like that. We have about 25% of our time that we do direct services to trans communities and to trans and non-binary survivors. And that's a repeat of that slide. So for the national work that we do, I've kind of shared already that we do lots of different kinds of trainings, publications, webinars, conferences, site visits, things that respond to one-on-one needs that folks have, providers have across the country. We're involved in some policy initiatives, a lot of collaborations with national partners, again, across the country who do fantastic work. And we help provide information and referrals to folks who need more information or more resources that are more specific than we can offer. The work that we do with survivors, again, kind of falls under some of those same categories of doing trainings, education, smaller groups that are support-oriented. We have a blog that is focused on trans survivors, And we, again, do a lot of information and referrals to trans folks and trans community members who need to get more connected in ways that we aren't set up to support. We do have a really small staff. So our core staff are me and Laurie, who's on the back end today, Caleb Weinhardt, and Shelley Gregory. So those are our core folks. And we try to do a lot of work that hopefully makes a bit of a difference for folks. Just a reminder of two guiding principles that hopefully you will see coming through in today's webinar. One is that we try to be trauma informed in all of the work that we do, and that is with providers as well as with the survivors and trans communities that we work with. And we try to be empowerment based. So that means empowering the survivors and trans community members, but it also means supporting and providing that empowerment framework for those of you who are providers or professionals who work with trans communities. You can find us on social media right now. We are on 4 platforms, so Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and on YouTube, which I don't really consider a social media platform, but I guess it is. We have not expanded out to TikTok, which may happen in the next year. Wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get to our main content. We're going to be interacting today mostly through an app on your phone called Poll Everywhere. So we encourage you to get out your cell phones. So they're not banned today. We encourage you to get them out and use them in our time that we have today. So once you've gone in or texted to Forge 333 and you text that to 22333, you will see the polls and the interaction as we come up. So you can have your phones at the ready. We'll also be using the chat, which so many of you have found already. So thank you for finding the chat, introducing yourselves. If you'd like to keep on introducing yourselves, that's great. You can always interact in the chat, even if we ask a question through Poll Everywhere. Just a reminder that people should be able to save the chat by those 3 dots that are at the bottom of the chat. Sometimes that doesn't seem to work with webinars, and if that's true, we will make sure to send out the links to you all after we're done. So let's try that first poll, and let me just process it and get it up. So Laurie put it in the chat, so you can either go to the website or text Forge 333 to 22333. So again, we're looking at who you are. So we're interested in if you are a therapist or advocate or healthcare provider, an educator, a trans community member, a friend, family, or ally, or something else. So if we just take a moment to have everybody share who you all are, that will help us kind of frame who we're working with today. Great, thank you for participating. And I'm just going to give it a couple seconds before we close this one. So it looks like a lot of you are trans community members, which is great, or something else, or therapists, which is perfect. Great, thank you. So let me set the stage really quickly. So this is a review for most folks probably that are here. We just wanted to frame with a couple of statistics, and then we're going to talk a lot about statistics as they relate to trans health disparities and ACEs. So just a reminder that we don't really know what the population of trans folks is in our country. It's someplace between 0.6 and 1%. A lot of folks are thinking that it's higher than that 1%, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Of that 1%, we have a lot of folks who are non-binary, about 1/3 who identify as trans men or trans masculine, 1/3 that identify as trans women or trans feminine. We know that that population base is increasing. So the young people today are more and more identifying as trans, as gender diverse, as gender expansive. So those numbers of 1% might actually be more close to 10% or 9.2% in this particular study that we're citing here. A couple of other global statistics before we move on is the high rates of sexual violence and intimate partner violence that trans community members face. So roughly 50% of trans folks, trans and non-binary folks, experience intimate partner violence, and 66% or so experience sexual violence. There are multiple studies that support this, and those numbers can be a little bit different if we look at fragments of our big, broad community. when we look at the rates of violence by gender vector, so those who are assigned female at birth and are more masculine identified, or assigned male at birth and are more feminine identified, or are gender fluid and don't really have a base or a destination. I just wanted to show folks that the rates of violence across those vectors, so the kind of the direction that people are leaning, is about the same for the 4 types of crimes that we often look at. So childhood sexual abuse, adult sexual assault, intimate partner violence, or stalking. So just keep that in mind as we move along today. Also wanted to just kind of put a pin in this, and we're going to really see this as we play out, that a lot of trans folks have experienced multiple types of crime or victimization. So you're going to see that really clearly today about how much trauma is within trans communities and trans individuals. And of course, I think this is obvious to most of us these days, but there are a lot of things that impact or affect how people are experiencing trauma, how people are experiencing barriers to trauma, and how people are experiencing increased access to services and care in some respects too. So things like race and disability, age, national origin, the language that people speak, their marital status, their sexual orientation, their religion, all of those kinds of things will impact folks' experience of trauma, their access to services, their barriers to services, and the challenges or successes that people may have in moving about their life. So Lorie's going to share with us a little bit about the ACE study and kind of how that all got started, and then we'll move to more details.
Thank you, Michael. The ACE study is the grounding for a lot of our current understandings about how victimization relates to negative health outcomes. And when we're talking about health outcomes, we're talking physical health as well as mental health. Next slide, please. The original study looked at 10 types of adverse childhood experiences. There was abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse of a child. There was physical and emotional neglect of a child. And there were 5 times of household dysfunction: mental illness, having one of the adults having mental illness, one of the adults being incarcerated, one of the adults having substance abuse issues, the mother being treated violently. This study took place before we were willing to admit that men are also abused in family violence, and also divorce. Next, please. Those adverse childhood experiences were totaled up. You would get 1 point for each type of adverse childhood experience you got, which means you could have a score up to 10. And you will immediately notice that that means we are not ranking how bad the various types of experiences were. Someone that had physical neglect, it could be very different from somebody else. Then they would both get the same point. So the scores were then correlated with a range of healthcare issues. Actually, Michael, could you go back? It looked at lack of physical activity, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, missed work, STDs or sexually transmitted diseases, suicide attempts, depression, diabetes, severe obesity, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, and even broken bones. And in every case, the more ACEs someone had, the higher their chances of having these sorts of health problems as an adult. Next, please. The relationship was very, very clear. This is just a sample of what they looked like, but you can see from this chart that as you got every additional ACE someone had, the more at risk they were for the various health problems. Next, please. For example, childhood experiences versus adult alcoholism. If you had 0 ACEs, you had like a 3% chance of being alcoholic. If you had 3 ACEs, you had an 11% chance of being alcoholic. And if you had 4 or more ACEs, you had a 16% chances of being an alcoholic as an adult. So how do we think this works? What's the connections? We think what happens is that adverse childhood experiences causes social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. In other words, we're supposed to be using our childhoods to learn how to be social with people, to learn how to emotionally regulate, and to start developing our brains. But if we are instead worried about being neglected or abused or the problems that are in our household, we don't get to spend as much time and energy on those growth issues. And so we end up somewhat impaired. That impairment can then lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors. If you're having problems in school, if you're having trouble making friends, maybe you'll start using substances in order to soothe yourself. So that once you have adopted health risk behavior, they can then in turn lead to disease, disability, and social problems. For instance, if you're an alcoholic, you may end up with driving while drunk charges, which is certainly going to add to the overall problems you're dealing with. And then the researchers did find that people with high ACEs did tend to die earlier than those with low or no ACEs. What's important for you to know is that there's a difference between various subpopulations in terms of how many ACEs the population tends to have. This chart shows you that the general public, about 58% of the general public has 1 ACE, but it goes up to 73% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual people, and 91% of trans people. Those who have 4+ ACEs is 20% of the general population, but for LGBT populations, it goes up to 70%, and trans goes up to 61%. So keep this in mind. There's some reason why we are having higher ACEs on average than the general population. The people that carried out the first and probably most important ACE study, Felitti and Anda, wrote, adverse childhood experiences are the main determinant of the health and social well-being of the nation. That sounds like it's kind of exaggerated, but they did not feel it was exaggerated. They felt that ACEs are that important to what our health is as a nation. So one of the things that we found is that transgender participants reported emotional abuse, physical neglect, and emotional neglect more frequently compared to cisgender LGBT people. And this webinar will talk a little bit about why Forge thinks this is happening.
Great. Thank you, Laurie. And just another note on this slide, this is just one of the relatively new pieces of journal articles, books that are talking about trans folks and ACEs. There's not a lot of literature out there, but there's a growing body of folks that are talking about this. So we want to just kind of, again, frame this a little bit with the reality that there's a lifelong history of violence and health disparities within trans communities. So when we look at trans communities, we know, like I shared with you a few slides ago, that trans folks are experiencing higher rates of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, hate crimes, which has dramatically increased over the last several years due to some of the political climate and political issues that are happening. We'll talk a little bit about that more as we move on as well. We know too that along with victimization that's being lifelong, we know that there are mental health care problems such as depression, anxiety, and suicidality. Again, we're going to go into more detail about that, and substance use. So a lot of those are lifelong issues for trans folks. So give a couple of examples. We know that trans youth are 3 times more likely to experience sexual abuse in the last 12 months of their life. And some of these are captured in the Youth Behavior Survey or the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. This is a little bit older of a study, but it shows that in other YRBS studies as well. We also know that trans kids are feeling unsafe in school. So again, we can look at the numbers. The numbers are important, but the reality is that trans kids are feeling either threatened at school, threatened with weapons, threatened with other types of injury. And that has led them to feel unsafe, whether it's with weapons or if it's through verbal or other forms of challenges that make them feel unsafe. We know that trans kids as well as trans adults are feeling suicidal and have made suicide attempts. So when we look at trans youth, 35% have attempted suicide versus 7% of non-trans youth. You can also look at the fact that 44% of trans youth have seriously considered suicide, so may not have attempted but have considered, and that's versus 16% of non-trans youth. That data is from the Trevor Project and is supported in other literature as well. So we're going to look next at the effects of ACEs on trans people. And so what you're going to see here is a bunch of things that sometimes line up really well and sometimes don't. So we're going to go through those pieces that Laurie broke out about, like smoking is the first one that we're going to talk about. And on the slide, you will see the original study of the Kaiser CDC study that shows the general population, this huge study that showed how many folks are engaging in smoking who have different levels of ACEs. So as you can see on the slide, folks that have 0 ACEs, roughly 6 or 7% are smokers. And those who have 5 or more ACEs or 4 or more ACEs, it's likely that they're smoking, 16% of them are smoking. So again, this is one of those places where we're going to compare, and we may not have exact levels of comparison. So we don't have ACE scores, but we can know a little bit about how many folks who are trans are using tobacco products. So the trans rate of folks that use tobacco or who smoke is someplace in the range of 30 to 45%. Some of that's from the US Trans Survey, which is in the process of being redone right now. So we encourage folks to take the new survey, but that's data from the 2015 survey. We can look at issues of alcohol use or abuse or drug use or abuse. We know that many trans and non-binary survivors and trans and non-binary non-survivors of abuse use substances to cope with their past or their current issues in life. So they may be coping with abuse issues or discrimination, or just the fact that life is really hard for a lot of folks who are trans or non-binary. So again, when we look at that CDC data of how many folks have how many ACEs, you can see that general population, around 2% of folks who have 2 to 3% of folks who have no ACEs use alcohol or use alcohol in what might be considered abusive ways. For folks in the general population that have 4 or more ACEs, they're going to be at the 14 or 15% who use alcohol. We can compare that to folks that are lesbian, gay, or bi, which that rate then is about 10 to 25%, again, depending on what survey you're looking at. And for trans folks are using alcohol at rates of 26 to 47%. And again, that data is from the US Trans Survey. Missing work is another one of the things that was captured in the ACE study. And we don't have a direct link to trans folks and ACEs and their missing work. But what we do know, again, based on the US Trans Survey, is that trans folks may do a lot of different things to that may affect their ability to be at work fully as themselves, to be the most productive and vibrant employees at their workplace. So we'll send out this data afterwards so you can see the kind of the breakdown of some of these details. But a lot of trans folks are hiding their gender identity at work. So more than half are doing so. And that could be folks that are transitioning or not transitioning, and how their gender plays out at work, and whether they disclose or don't disclose their gender identity. Many trans folks may not be asking their employers or their coworkers to use their current name or pronouns. There are lots of different things that trans folks might be doing to protect themselves, protect their gender identity, maybe altering their gender expression. And all of those things can lead to a lot more additional stress, and may lead to missing work more frequently because of the stress that puts on them. We know that those folks who are missing work may be doing so due to employment discrimination. It may be just too hard to be at work. We also know that there are anti-trans harassment issues that happen in the workplace that may or may not be protected under local, state, or federal law. We know that people experience minority stress. We'll talk a little bit about what minority stress is in just a minute. We know too, based on the current the past slides, that folks are using alcohol and drugs a bit more than other folks. So folks that use alcohol and drugs may be not as functional the next morning to get up and go to work. We also know that trans folks are oftentimes in low-paying jobs that may have harsh work environments, maybe physical labor, maybe really tedious tasks, and they might be working jobs that don't have any sick pay or any time off. So they might be missing work because they're sick or tired or stressed or any of those things. We know that there can be some impact on missing work or missing school. We know that a lot of trans youth are dropping out of school or getting kicked out of school. They may have challenges with poor work or school performance, again, based on some of those things that I just shared. There might be some isolation in work or school environments that lead to increased health disparities and increased challenges. And all of those things can lead to things like increased depression or anxiety. Again, we can look at what some of the economic disparities are that result from missing work, missing school, not being there as much. And that can lead to things like lack of housing or lack of solid or stable housing, employment discrimination, which may or may not get talked about or addressed, and folks possibly entering the street economy out of lack of adequate employment through like W-2 types of employment, or through just the need to have increased income in order to live. We're going to be sharing photos throughout just as reminders to all of us about the resilience and the vibrance of trans folks, just to help us keep that in mind as we move through this difficult set of subjects. When we look at other impacts of ACEs, we can look at physical activity or severe obesity. And I just want to be really clear that obesity is the language that CDC used, and a lot of folks that are in community and a lot of folks who are working in mental health fields or in disability fields or in trans communities don't like the word obesity because it has a lot of stigma and shame. So again, not our word. We don't have a lot of good data around trans folks and weight and activity, but we do know things that depression and anxiety, which trans and non-binary folks have more of than non-trans folks, can lead to inactivity or overeating. So it can lead to higher weight. We know that things like isolation can affect if somebody goes to the gym or not, or goes for a walk in the park, or is active in some way. If they're staying home, they're going to be likely going to be less active, and possibly may not eat as healthy of foods if they're eating by themselves and not sharing with others, which might change how much they eat or what they're eating. We also know that low income leads to oftentimes having less access to healthy proteins, fresh fruits or vegetables. So those kinds of things contribute to higher weight, lower activity, things like that. We can look at these next categories of depression and suicide attempts. And this is where some of the data is really quite profound. We can look at suicide attempts for non-trans or general populations. So folks that have 0 ACEs are generally going to have very, very, very few suicide attempts. Non-trans populations that have 7 or more ACEs will be attempting suicide roughly about 35% of those folks. So that you can see in the slide that there's definitely a rapid increase in suicide attempts as more and more ACEs are accumulated within the general population. So when we look at trans populations, when we look at trans youth, 40% or more have attempted suicide. And we look at trans folks, 40% or more, so upwards of 76%, have attempted suicide. So that is a really profound set of numbers compared to non-trans folks. Just wanted to frame this a little bit more about suicide attempts and the relationship between abuse and suicide. So again, we can look at kind of the general population and what the suicide attempt rate is. So, roughly about 4 or 5% in general. When we look at all trans respondents, it's more like that 40%. When we look at folks who have experienced sexual assault or intimate partner violence, suicide attempt rates go into the 60%. When we look at folks who have experienced abuse by teachers, so physical abuse or sexual assault by teachers, so this is abuses that are happening in their childhood, their suicide attempt might be in childhood or in adulthood, and those folks are experiencing or attempting suicide between 69 and 76%. So really profound numbers there. So the high rates of suicide and depression, trans people are not inherently more suicidal, not inherently more depressed than other folks, but there are those high rates of abuse that contribute to those suicidal feelings or actions. There also can be lower access to health supports. So professional mental health, peer-based mental health, insurance might be a challenge. So people may not be able to afford mental health access, may not be able to take the time off of work to go to therapy or support groups. And that widespread discrimination can really impact folks and increase the level of depression and suicidality. Let's look at sexually transmitted infections. And again, we don't have a good comparative rate here, but we can look at, CDC talks about risky sexual behavior. And I want to be really clear that risky sexual behavior doesn't equal sexually transmitted infections. There's a lot of things that folks can do to protect themselves against infection. But when the CDC looked at risky sexual behavior, you can see again, there's an increase from those who have 0 ACEs to those who have 4 or more ACEs. I wanted to share just a couple of, again, these are kind of non-connected things that trans people embody. So there is a fairly high rate of trans folks who engage in the street economy or in sex work. That's roughly about 20% of folks who at some point in their life engage in sex for money, sex for housing, sex for basic needs. There's also a higher rate of HIV infection. This is particularly true of trans women and trans women of color, which may or may not be related to active sex work, may or may not be related to folks who engage in sex with folks who may take higher risks because they don't believe they are worthy or lovable in ways that they would take higher risk behaviors. So again, this is, I jumped ahead of myself a little bit. So again, people that don't feel that they are lovable may engage in unprotected sexual behaviors. They may lack sexual education, positive sex ed that talks about trans bodies and trans existence. And we know that this is more and more true as there have been restrictions across the country on what sex ed classes, what sexual health and healthy relationship can look like in adolescent and childhood education classes at school. We also know that many people who have been sexually assaulted at early ages may view that as their education, as what they think is normal or healthy behavior when it's not healthy behavior. So if sexual abuse is the only kind of education that they get, they're going to see that as normal moving forward. Again, high rates of sex work may increase people's likelihood of contracting HIV if their behaviors are not protective. And trans bodies might not fit typical protection barriers. So oftentimes we only hear about safer behaviors that include condoms. And there's a lot more that can be needed or used for trans bodies. And one of the great things is that more and more people are using PrEP or other kind of prophylactic measures, which can really reduce HIV levels for trans folks and for everybody. Wanted to share a video with you all about Jada, who is going to share a little bit about HIV.
I would tell HIV that you have been the greatest teacher I've ever had. You've taught me so much, so many positives and so many negatives, but you've also taught me that I'm more than I think I am, and I can accomplish more than I give myself credit for. When I found out I had HIV, I was 1 week from turning 21, and I felt like my life was over. I kind of felt like it was time to die. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't go into treatment, and I had been in shock. I was scared. Getting into care has been a really wild experience. From when I first found out I had HIV up until now, I've been back and forth with treatment, but recently it's been the longest stretch. It's been almost 10 years now since I've been on treatment, and I've transitioned within the last 5. I continue to see this fabulous doctor because she works with me. If I say that there's this or that needs to be addressed, she focuses and she gives me the attention that I need. She talks about different things with me without stigma, without judging. And I think that's very important. I'm very open. I've learned a lot. Even through transitioning with my medical provider, she's been ultra sensitive and very helpful in this transition. Something that motivated me to stay in care was when, after a couple of years, my T cells were over 900 and my viral load has been undetectable. It made me feel empowered. Something that I would tell a trans girl who is hesitant to start treatment is don't wait until your body has disintegrated. Don't wait until your immune system is so fragile that someone can sing and break it. Don't do it. It's so hard to recover. I would tell a trans girl who's coming into herself, finding out she had HIV, darling, it gets nothing but better. If you can look and use me as an example, use me as your support, we can accomplish this. Living well means living, not waiting for, oh, I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna do that in my life. I have made it a point to live. I'm gonna rock it out and I'm gonna live it to the max. That's what living well means to me. HIV treatment works. Get in care, stay in care, live well.
So that video is from a few years ago. And as you can hopefully see, Jada is a fierce badass, excuse my language, but she's fantastic and just amazing. So I hope some of you heard some of the pieces in there about the provider that she sees and how there's no stigma and she can ask questions and her provider is really attentive and responds to her. And that's not always true for a lot of trans folks who experience a lot of challenges in accessing healthcare. But it is possible. And I always like to show this video because it reminds both trans communities as well as other providers that having really good quality care can really be life-saving and life-changing. So when we look at this combination of the rest of those health disparities that change with increased ACEs, we don't have a lot of good data that's trans-specific. So when we look at diabetes, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, broken bones, we don't have a lot of good data. But what we do know is that trans folks are avoiding healthcare out of fear. So again, I'm showing a range of the numbers because there's a difference between folks that identify as trans men versus trans women versus non-binary folks. But there are a lot of folks that are avoiding care because they fear being disrespected in a healthcare setting or being mistreated. And there's a lot of good reasons why people have fear about accessing healthcare and working with healthcare providers. And that is because that people have negative experiences. So, between 25 and 42% of folks have negative experiences with their healthcare providers. And of those people, they share their experiences with their friends and people in their community. So people can have increased fears because of their own experiences with negative healthcare, or because they've learned about it through their friends, their colleagues, their communities. All right, so that was a lot of data, and we're going to have more data as we go through even the next section. But I encourage folks to take a moment to breathe and to refresh for a moment before we move into the next session. So again, if you need to stretch or breathe or turn your head, please take that moment to do that now or as we continue on. I wanted to also help refresh us with another quote. We're going to share some quotes that are about positivity and about some vibrance, and this is one of them. So Sage Grace Dolan Sendrino says, trans people are extraordinary, strong, intelligent, persistent, and resilient. All right, so let's look at some trans-specific ACEs. So Laurie laid out really well the kind of that core structure, right, of that pyramid and what happens when people have more ACEs in their life and what kind of negative health outcomes they have. We believe at Forge that there are some very specific things that trans people oftentimes experience that are going to add to those health disparities. And we're going to talk about 8 of those things. And before we do that, we'd like to get an idea of what you all think are some trans-specific issues, things in childhood that may play a role in becoming like an ACE, if you will. So what are some other types of ACEs that trans people might experience? So you can get out your phones again. Laurie put it in the chat. You can either text or go to the website and we'll just see what comes up here. So rejection by parents, rejection of identity from family, excellent. Bullying in schools, homelessness, yes. What other things might trans people experience? Invalidation of gender identity, constant misgendering, yes. Being misgendered, being outed without their consent, sexual abuse or coercion. What other things might be specific to trans people? Dead naming, conversion therapy practices, yes. I'm seeing in the other chat, colonialism, patriarchy of Native trans folks. Yeah. Religious trauma, yes, definitely. Internal struggles, yeah. Lack of trans-inclusive healthcare and education, yes. What else might trans people be experiencing early in life that might be considered an ACE, an adverse childhood experience? You all came up with some really great things, and we're going to talk a little bit more about many of those things as we move forward. Thank you for contributing. So one of the first things that we have included as a trans-specific ACE is bullying. So many of you kind of made comments about that in that brainstorm. So trans youth and non-binary youth and gender expansive youth can experience bullying in many different environments. So at school, at home, in their neighborhoods, on the streets, in extracurricular activities like sports or music or band, or any of those places. And so we know that that oftentimes is a really primal experience that trans folks are having and really shape their life experiences and their view of the world. We know that anti-trans bullying in general can be really profound and impact lots of levels of people's lives, lots of areas. We know things, just a couple more statistics, that 60% of trans youth have been forced to use a bathroom or locker room that doesn't match their gender identity or presentation. This again is from data from 2017. So we're 5 years out from that. This data might be actually higher now that some of the cultural issues have shaped what schools are doing, and it might be less in some school communities. We know that, again, from the study in 2017, that 50% of trans youth are called by an incorrect name at least some of the time. And just under 30% are not allowed to wear the clothes that align with their gender identity. And Lorie's going to read a couple of quotes as we move through, just to kind of highlight these different ACEs.
I have encountered verbal harassment in the bathroom and people peeping into the stall saying, "Look, it's a girl," and other similar incidents that made me feel unsafe.
Thanks, Lorie. So that's one example of how bullying might look, or what the experience might be for folks. And we're also going to offer, so we have the ACE of bullying, the quote that kind of frames what it is, and then a comment about resilience and what can be done. And we're going to move through and talk about what can be done as we move on today. So one of the kind of antidotes to bullying is figuring out how we can help folks build social networks. So rather than isolating folks through bullying, how can we be welcoming, creating networks that are supportive? The photo that's on the slide right now is of a bunch of a bunch of non-trans teachers who came to a rally in 2017 when Trump first came into office, and there was a lot of concerns about safety for trans kids and rollback of federal rights and protections. So these teachers really came out and supported their trans youth in their schools. A second ACE is denial of identity. So several of you mentioned that in the brainstorm. So this can be express itself in a lot of different ways. So, sometimes parents really want to be supportive, and they believe that by telling their kid, "No, you're not trans," or "No, you're not really a girl," or "No, you're not really a boy," is a way to protect them. So parents may say things like, "It's just a phase," or "He'll grow out of it," or "How could she possibly know? She's only 3 years old," or "He's just confused." And again, these are things that are oftentimes meant to be supportive by parents. Sometimes it's meant to not be supportive, but those kinds of things really have a deep impact on kids. Parents or adults may choose to not talk about or discourage their kids from talking about their trans identities. That can be another denial of identity. Not allowing kids to go to family events or social events can be another way of saying, "You can't be yourself and go to these places as a family or with us." So again, even well-meaning parents want their kids, to have a good life, and that's in big quotes, and want their kids to be accepted. So many try to change their kids' gender identity. We have more and more parents these days who are not trying to change their kids' gender identity, which is fantastic, but there are still some that do. Sometimes parents feel ambivalent about their trans kids, at least at first. And sometimes people don't want to condone or encourage trans identities, again, in order of their belief to want their kids to have a good life that's not filled with discrimination. So those well-meaning parents, that messaging does not get through to the kid, right? So the youth perceive these messages as rejecting behaviors. And when youth feel rejected, they're much more likely to engage in higher risk behaviors and have higher health disparities. So this slide is from the Family Acceptance Project, which is a fantastic resource. Most of their work has been on lesbian, gay, and bi folks, but it applies really well to trans folks, in addition to lesbian, gay, and bi folks. So 8 times higher rates of suicide attempt for those who feel rejection by their parents or adults, 6 times more likely to report levels of depression, 3 times more likely to use street drugs or non-prescribed drugs, 3 times more likely to have HIV or STIs. Lori, another quote, please.
When my daughter was little, I spent so much time fussing over how she looked. I should have been concerned about how she felt. We didn't know about transgender, but I know how sad and depressed she got right before middle school. The school helped us find a counselor, and that's when we found out how hopeless she felt. I wanted to make sure she wasn't rejected by others, but instead, I was the one who was rejecting her. I'm so grateful I could change things before it was too late.
Great, thanks, Lorraine. So one of the people in the brainstorm mentioned conversion therapy, and that is a huge denial of identity and kind of, I don't want to say the extreme of it, but it's definitely on that end of the bell curve. So we know that conversion therapy oftentimes is within religious settings or framed as religious, or is a therapeutic, in massive air quotes, a therapeutic attempt to change someone's sexual orientation or their gender identity or gender expression. We know that lots of people in the US are still being subjected to conversion therapy, whether it's called that or not. And it has a wide range of negative consequences. So I'm going to share with you a video. And again, this video is a few years old, but is very, very, very relevant in today's world as well.
So reparative therapy, you might also know it as conversion therapy or ex-gay therapy or sexual orientation change efforts, is a series of these dangerous and completely discredited practices engaged in by mental health practitioners trying to change a person's sexual orientation or gender identity.
It's absolutely devastating experience for a young person to go through, and most of the young people who are subjected to that suffer lifelong, really permanent damage.
And they will subject these kids to these awful, awful treatments that in the past have ranged from electroshock therapy to nausea-inducing drugs that now are primarily talk therapy, but that still, even when you take the electroshock therapy out of it, they result in substance abuse, they result in depression and anxiety, and a lot of the times they result in suicide, and we have lost way too many of our survivors along the way because of it.
That's why we are so grateful to have a chance to work with survivors like Ryan Kendall, who somehow managed to survive, not only survive that experience, but to turn his life around completely, going from being, homeless, living on the streets, completely separated from his family with very bleak prospects for the future, to he was just so determined to not let that experience destroy his life. And he was able to go to school. He's going to law school now. We're so proud of him, and he has worked with us to pass the first law ever in the entire country that bars therapists in California from trying to change a young person's sexual orientation or gender identity. He's now helped us to pass a similar law in New Jersey, and we are working on other state laws in an additional 20 states now. Thanks to Ryan and our partnership with him, we're really changing the country on this issue.
It takes years, sometimes decades, sometimes a lifetime before people can actually come out and talk about this. Sam is somebody who is willing to get up in front of a room full of people and tell a story that I cannot imagine having to relive as often as Sam does, with vulnerability and humor and genuine sweetness and willingness to connect to an audience that might not always know how to ask the right questions, that might sometimes make it worse. Sam is willing to put themselves on the line, and honestly their own well-being on the line, to make sure that these people know what happened, know what still happens, and are engaged and committed to making sure it doesn't happen again. Sam is also an MIT student in nuclear engineering technology. Sam has never let what happened years ago be the defining factor. Sam is a force. I cannot wait to just keep being a friend, keep being a colleague, and keep watching what happens to the world as Sam grows up in it.
So one of the reasons why I wanted to share this video in particular right now is the last person that was just talked about, Sam Brinton. was a MIT student in nuclear engineering before, and is now working for the Biden administration as I got to read this off, as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Spent Fuel and Waste Disposition. So this person, as a kid who experienced so much harsh treatment and conversion therapy, is now working in the current presidential administration. So fantastic things can happen to radically wonderful, fierce people. So one of the things that we can do, again, to kind of counteract some of the conversion therapy efforts is to see people's wholeness. I mean, it's kind of the opposite of that. We're saying, I see you instead of go away. A third ACE is being expelled from home or expelled from school. We know that trans youth are more likely to be expelled from home when they're kids. And we also know that adults who are trans are experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity as adults, not just as children. So roughly 1 in 5 folks as adults experience homelessness at some point in their life. So Lori, I'll just take care of reading this. So this is a survivor's quote about homelessness. It says, "I haven't had a warm place to sleep for 3 weeks. The only food I've had comes from grabbing food at my tricks houses." So this is a reminder too of, like, you know, not having a home also means oftentimes not having adequate food. So some of the things that we can do about that build resilience are we can make sure that we have healthy relationships in our lives, share those healthy relationships, whether it's just by example, reminding folks that parents and family members can and do love their trans kids, adult kids, or child kids, and inviting people over and helping create family in your own life to folks who may not have a family that's healthy for them. Police misconduct is the fourth trans ACE that we'll talk about. And I think many of us know that police misconduct is just extremely high and extremely damaging. And it affects many minority communities, many communities who have historically experienced a lot of trauma as well. So we're seeing folks of color who are also trans experiencing high rates of police misconduct. Trans youth experiencing high rates of misconduct. Folks that are homeless are going to be experiencing high rates of police misconduct as well. Folks that are engaged in street economies are again going to be experiencing higher rates of police misconduct. It can be overt discrimination. So stop and frisk laws, which are supposed to be illegal, but are still existing in many communities, or it can be overt violence. Lori, can you read this?
"They referred to me as a female at first, but after they checked my ID, they referred to me as a male. They treated me as a prostitute and told me to leave or else I'd be arrested."
Thank you. So another example of how police conduct may play out. One of the things that we can do, and this could be true for all of these trans-specific ACEs, is working towards justice. So police misconduct, you know, again, affects lots and lots and lots of communities. We can work towards changing some of those policies and policing behaviors to hopefully create a safer and kinder world. So the next ACE we're going to talk about is microaggressions. And Lori, are you willing to read out this one definition of microaggression?
"Microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate derogatory or negative slights and insults, or even some hostility toward a group of people. These words and actions establish, reflect, and reinforce the dominant paradigm, erasing the experiences and realities of a minority."
Thank you. So a lot of us know what microaggressions are, and we many of us experience them every day about a number of different factors about who we are. I wanted to share just a couple of examples. These are from the GLAAD website. And just a couple of examples are, you know, somebody says to somebody, "Wow, I would have never known you used to be a girl." That's a microaggression. Or another one could be, "You're so beautiful for a trans girl." So those are just a couple of examples, and I'm sure many of you could come up with dozens and dozens more of what trans people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. One of the things that we can do about microaggressions to counter them is to call in folks that say things or express sentiments that are anti-trans or that are microaggressions or macroaggressions. We can make sure that we reach out to the person who has experienced that microaggression and offer an ear or an ask of, hey, what would you like me to do about that? Is there something I could do to support you? The next trans specific ACE is around minority stress. And so, Laurie, could you read minority stress and how it differs from microaggressions?
Minority stress is the result of observable incidents, vigilance for future incidents, and a person's decision that the incident is related to that person's minority status. As a result, they internalize this process as stress.
And this is something that, when people live with this type of stress, and I always talk about this as the stress with a big capital S, when that happens on a daily basis, it can really have negative health implications, both physical and emotional health.
I had to end one course of therapy because the therapist suggested my ex had become trans because he was a child sexual assault survivor.
Thanks. So, while this isn't a direct connection to minority stress, it really frames one of the critical issues that so many trans survivors and loved ones are facing. So, just kind of this combination of what community is and how minority stress can play out in some different ways. So some of the things that we can do to try to counteract that is increase access to support and healing. And those of you who are providers on this call, that's something that we as providers can do all the time. And we can also try to enable access to support and healing in many other ways. The second to the last trans-specific ACE is around legislated discrimination. And I know that many of you, probably all of you, are seeing what's going on in the news right now. So legislated efforts, or even if they haven't made it to the point of legislation, but are at a policy level at a school or in a community, they can really, really, really disrupt someone's education, their learning experience. When they're not allowed to use the right bathroom, when they're not allowed to play on the right sports team, all of those things can really impact their ability to learn and to stay in school. So like Laurie mentioned in the beginning, when kids are worried about or experiencing all of those negative things in childhood, they're going to miss out on some of those key developmental skills that would normally happen. Like when they play on a sports team, they would learn about teamwork and cooperation. If they're not allowed to play, they're going to miss out on those developmental skills. Again, if people don't have a safe bathroom, how can they think in school if all they're thinking about is that they need to use the restroom? They may not be eating. Sorry about that. We usually have really good internet. Trans youth might be afraid to be themselves because of that legislated discrimination. We know that the political climate is really creating a lot of fear for folks, really well-grounded fear, fear of being outed, fear around folks' immigration status on top of being trans for those that are impacted by immigration, risks of safety, walking down the street, at home, at school, in every place that folks are going, concerns about not being treated at all, so trying to access services but not being treated, denied care. And there can be some other issues that relate to the rollback of rights. So we had a rollback of some federal rights under the prior administration. We have now had the rolling up, the reversal of some of those rollbacks on the federal level, but we're seeing state level discrimination and legislation and policies that are being written. Just a couple of examples, and there have been more examples that are a little bit more current. They're happening all the time. But this is from earlier this summer, when in Texas, the trans kids were really, really terrified after the governor ordered that parents be investigated for child abuse. That governor was just re-elected and really is anti-trans. So a lot of parents were, being threatened with CPS, Child Protective Services, being called on them when they got their kids trans-affirming care. Another example of how the political climate is impacting folks is that pediatricians who serve trans youth are fearing harassment and fearing being put in jail. So those are just two examples of what's going on currently in our country. Lori?
Every day, I wake up to my newsfeed flooded with another person killed by police, another new law that takes away LGBT rights, another slew of protests because Black Lives Matter, another set of memes with quotes that real people in government mocking who I am. As a Black queer survivor of police violence, I don't know how much more I can take.
So that's both an example of the political landscape and not microaggressions, but macroaggressions, right? Just how it so impacts somebody's life every single day, many minutes out of those days. So one of the things that we can do is work towards trans and other rights, as we're seeing so many folks do. And the last piece is similar to the last one, and this one is about culture-wide discrimination. And many of us remember a few years ago when Leila Alcorn, who did end up dying by suicide, said, "Fix society, please." So the reminder that it's society that's broken, not the trans community or not trans people. And we're seeing things like the Proud Boys terrorizing, kids who are going to a drag queen story hour. We're seeing that happen as culture-wide discrimination, culture-wide negative experiences that people are running into every day. Lori?
News from a 15-year-old boy I tutor. There's a kid in my religion class who I have no idea if they're a boy or a girl. So when I see them, I just call them fam. And my plaintive look of, I don't know if I heard you right, like family. The youth have spoken and fam is the gender neutral bro.
So another example of resilience. And so we're seeing that more and more that, the kids are talking, the kids got it right, and they're influencing what their parents and their family and the adults around them are doing. So way cool for kids who are finding creative language and sharing it with the previously clueless adults in their life. So let's look at disrupting the ACEs and what some of the practical interventions are. So we're going to do another quick poll. So Lori, if you can pop that in the chat again. So what kinds of things can you do to create some protective factors? So those things that I was kind of showing as like the things that you can do, what can you do to kind of disrupt those ACEs and the negative things that are happening in trans kids' lives or trans adults' lives? So again, if you want to type in or thumb in with your phone or your computer, what can you do to help build protective factors? Affirming parents, yes. And that can mean affirming parents, like I'm going to affirm you for being a good parent, or it could mean having affirming parents. What else can people do to help build some protective factors? Affirm, 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 yes. Connect to community and resources, yes. Community resource, community empowerment. Be safe adults for queer kids, yeah. Education and resources on how to be affirming, yeah. Advocate for legislation that protects trans kids and vote for folks who propose them. Yeah, validate others' experiences of mistreatment. Vote for political allies, pay for their trans kids' therapy, yes. Advocate within our own communities, exactly. Model queer joy and resilience, yes, 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 yes. For the sake of time, I'm going to stop at that one. You all can keep on going with that. Fantastic, really fantastic. So way to go. I love this picture. I've used it several times in workshops. If you're in good light, you can see that this is kind of a trans pride colored t-shirt made by the dust of colorful colorful chalk. So it's fantastic. So how can you help? What are some prevention strategies? And I'm going to go through these really quickly so we can get to some resources and maybe some questions at the end. So the CDC proposed these 3 things that can be helpful, and they really speak for themselves, and you can kind of brainstorm off of these things as we go through them. So the first one is about safety opposing neglect and violence. So when we create safe environments, when we create safety in our homes, in our work, in our schools, in our communities, that opposes neglect and violence. The second thing is around stability. So stability counters chaos and unpredictability. So when we can create that base, when we're the safe home on the block, when we are the leader of the GSA that holds space for kids at school, when we create that stability, that people know, hey, I got your back, you're good here, that's going to counter chaos and unpredictability. And the third thing is about how nurturing opposes hostility and rejection. So we heard a lot today about the hostility and rejection that trans folks are facing, both youth and adults. We know that when nurturing happens, it opposes that hostility and rejection. It doesn't take it away, but it can really do a lot. And nurturing can be a lot of things. And nurturing is not just about kids. It can be making positive comments. It can be being willing to hug people if they are open to physical touch. It can be about creating environments that are nurturing. It can be about lots of different things. Again, your mind can go to lots of different places of how you can create nurturing environments. All right, so we can all make a difference. It doesn't have to happen at the policy level. It doesn't have to happen within systems. We can each make a difference. So we know from places like the Trevor Project and the Family Acceptance Project that, that one person can make a difference, and that one supportive adult can significantly lower trans youth and trans adults' suicidality by 40%. So again, we have really high rates of trans suicide attempts. When we have a supportive adult, a supportive person in somebody's life, that suicidal feeling is going to drop by 40%. That's really, really important and significant. I wanted to share with you 2 more kind of bits and pieces around this, making your support visible and creating that supportive environment. So this is a card that was given to a neighbor. This happens to be in Wisconsin, and this little card says, "Dear neighbor, I wanted to give you a big thank you for having a pride flag on your house. It truly gives me a sense of safety and pride, both within the LGBTQIA+ community and within our city's community. Happy Pride." So this was given and shared to a person whose house had a trans pride flag outside of it a couple years ago in June. And happens to be at the houses of these 2 absolutely wonderful people. So Helen Boyd Kramer and Rachel Crowell. And just a reminder of what else you can do to make things visible, make your support visible. You could have trans pride flags places. And I'm reminded this time of year, I believe it was last year in our community, our community by our house, we were taking a walk, and there was a house that had a basket full of trans pride flags, those little teeny, like, 4th of July sized flags. And they were free for people to take. They had rainbow flags as well as trans flags. And we still have one of those little teeny flags sitting out on our porch in the dirt in our little flower bed. So like you could do things like that, as well as like having a trans pride flag on display. We know that when you do things like have name tags or buttons or share your pronouns with folks, that can be making your support visible. You can have bumper stickers. And again, it doesn't have to be trans bumper stickers, but it can be about showing you're supportive of all different kinds of people. You can have safe space signs. You can have all gender restrooms if you're a business or a provider. I wanted to share this video, especially for folks that are in Wisconsin. This was created by filmmaker and actor Rachel Crowell. And this was created, I believe, 2 years ago when there was a an anti-trans kids in sports initiative. And it's a lovely video about resilience and some of the things that we can do affirmatively.
I learned that practice pays off.
I learned the value of hard work.
I became a part of something bigger than myself.
I wasn't great in school, but baseball and eventually softball motivated me to really work hard.
I never played college ball. I never went pro. But through mushing, I got to be part of something.
I learned how to win and how to lose and how to keep going either way.
I grew stronger.
I grew more confident.
I met some of my best friends.
I had fun.
I treasured those memories.
I hope all kids get the chance that I got.
I hope every kid in Wisconsin can be part of the team.
Trans inclusion is important to me. I coach kids in soccer that are gender fluid and non-binary. My kids are on their team, and those are just their teammates to them.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, deja a niños que jueguen.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
I just want to play with my friends. Bye.
So that is one example, which I think is just fabulous and wonderful, of both trans and non-trans folks really uplifting trans youth and our communities. Let me share with you a few resources, and Laurie will put these in the chat, and we can send these out afterwards as well. So we talked a little bit about the legislative efforts that are not always positive. The Equality Federation is a great place to stay up to date on state-by-state legislative actions, initiatives, things that are passing or things that are in the works. They don't rank them as positive or negative, so you have to kind of go in and determine what you think is going on with each of those. We started out by talking about the original Kaiser CDC ACE study, so it's definitely worth checking that out and learning more about the basis of that study, as well as looking at some of the growing body of research on resilience, and looking at the growing body of research on resilience that's trans focused. We oftentimes hear about what's wrong and what's hard for trans folks, but not always about what's right and what is resilient for folks. I mentioned before the Family Acceptance Project, which is really a fantastic resource for folks. So again, check them out and the work that they've done on how positive interactions in families can lead to better health outcomes, and where rejection leads to negative health outcomes. A couple years ago, we worked with, we were one of 8 partners on a huge project funded by the Office for Victims of Crime, and we created several resources on supporting trans and LGBTQ youth and how that's violence prevention. So we encourage folks to go to reachingvictims.org, and there are a couple of webinars and a couple of publications there as well. We also encourage folks to, who are providers, to get a hold of things like this little trifold. It's actually more than trifold. It's this little rat card that talks about IPV within trans communities. We were part of helping make that, and Futures Without Violence distributes them. And they also, we also have a bunch of them. So if people would like them for your office, it's another way that you can help remind people what healthy relationships look like and what doesn't need to be tolerated. We also would encourage folks to keep learning, whether that's keep learning with Forge resources or any of the other resources that we shared, or beyond those resources. I'm a firm believer that we all keep on learning forever in our lives, and if we don't, we kind of get stagnant, and well, we just need to keep learning. So I encourage you to learn where you need to learn and where you feel you have a knowledge gap. I wanted to close us out before we do a little bit of questions with kind of a campaign that we're doing during during November this year. In the last several years, we've done 30 days of action during November. November houses the Trans Day of Remembrance, which is a very somber day remembering those people who have been killed by anti-trans violence. And so in other years, we've done action steps for people to take action every day to try to counteract some of the violence that trans people experience. This year, we decided to focus on trans hope and trans joy. Because I think a lot of us know what's going on in terms of violence, and a lot of us are taking action already. So it's a good time to remind us of what is going right for people, what's going well for people, how trans folks are experiencing hope and joy. So I wanted to have a couple of them up on the screen so that Laurie can read them. And I encourage you to follow us on social media. We're posting them on all the platforms for you to see a vibrant photo of the folks who are offering the quote. And they're really, really wonderful quotes. Laurie?
What gives me hope for the future is that in the future, we will be able to live like everyone else. We will not have to explain our trueness, value, and worth.
So that was a quote from Jennifer Louise Lopez.
Watching all the young trans kids grow into themselves with the support and love from community, family, and friends, despite all the anti-trans legislation being passed, we are a resilient and strong community. That's trans joy for me.
That's Javon Mark. Oops, sorry.
Trans and gender diverse joy is the rejoicing, the celebration of self, the party in the heart that propels us forward in ways that reveal to us and those around us that this is what was missing that everyone else has.
And that is from Antonia Eldorce.
What gives me hope is that as trans people, we have to continue to be visible in a community that has wanted us to hide. We have to speak up and show up. As John Lewis said, we have to create good trouble.
Thanks, Laurie. That was from Charlie Burton. So again, please find us on social media and take a look at the hashtags of 30 Days of Hope or 30 Days of Trans Joy. Let's do one more set of interactions. So if you have your phones out and can do it, let's look at what you can do to uplift trans folks. So we just gave you some ideas of things that you can do, but let's end with some positive thoughts about what each of us can do to help build people's strength, resilience, and ability to thrive. Be supportive, yes. Lend an ear. Ask them to share their gender euphoria, or we can share ours, yes. Donate pins and stickers to schools, yep. What else can we do? They can be little tiny things that make a huge difference. Support parents in Facebook groups, yeah. What else can people do to support resilience, support thriving? And I know we're at the end of an hour and a half, so people might be getting tired. Provide resources, listen, be voice for trans rights. Yeah. Encourage your kids to sign up for Rainbow Library. So the school library had representative books. Excellent. Yeah. Testifying, chalk drawings on sidewalks. Excellent. Support visibility in public spaces. Give hugs and smiles. Yeah. All of those things and many, many more. So I encourage you all, not that anybody needs homework these days, but to think about those little actions that you all can take, that we all can take, that make the world a better place for all of us, but in particular for trans and non-binary youth and adults. Thank you for contributing your ideas. We have a few minutes left for questions. If folks would like to ask anonymous questions, you can do so in the Q&A box, or feel free to also put them in the chat. And I'm wondering, Laurie, if you have seen any questions that have come in that we can address, or comments that folks would like to make.
No, I transferred one that was a comment into the chat.
Great. Any folks have questions or comments that you would like to share as we wrap up today? I'm going to put my contact information on the slide for a second. I know Laurie typed that into the chat message as well. If folks do have questions or comments, we would love to hear them. Laurie, if you can pop in the evaluation into the chat, that would be super helpful. We really value your feedback and we read them carefully and we respond to them. So if you would take a moment, it's a quick evaluation. We would really appreciate your thoughts about today's event as well as about future trainings. Thank you, Lori, for being the back end today. And thank you all for being here and spending 90 minutes with us. We look forward to seeing you again. Thanks a lot, everybody.